everyone. I've got a pretty exciting paper for you today. I forgot to introduce myself though last time, so let me just get that out of the way. I'm Adam Dede, and I'm a postdoc in Beth Buffalo's lab at the University of Washington. And this is just kind of my journal club project, trying to encourage me to read more and hopefully make some scientific literature a little bit more accessible. So today I'm going to talk about hippocampal cortical interactions during periods of subcortical silence. And this is a paper that came out in 2012 in Nature by Logothetis, Eschenko, Murayama, Agath, Stodel, Evrard, Besserev, Holterman. Sorry for the mispronunciation of names. But this paper, actually, I saw the results presented in 2013 at the Society for Neuroscience in a talk given by Logothetis, and it was really just an inspirational thing to me to see the results from this paper and really kind of change the trajectory of my own path with science. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into it. So first of all, the goal of this paper was to try and record sharp wave ripples in the hippocampus. So in order to do that, they put electrodes into the CA1 region of the hippocampus in macaque monkeys. And here we're looking at a sideways view of a macaque monkey brain. This vertical dashed line indicates an area of cross-section, which is then blown up in this next panel, and you can see the trajectory. Hey, Aziza, you're being loud. And you can see the trajectory of an electrode going into the hippocampus here. And then over on the right side, we can see traces of electrical activity where this scale bar tells us that this distance here is 100 milliseconds and this vertical distance is 1 millivolt. And what you can see is that there are all of these channels here where we see this huge increase in the amplitude, and we also see this sharp up and down activity, or sorry, this quick rippling up and down activity, I should say. So this sharp upward deflection and this quick ripple riding on the top, hence the name sharp wave ripple. So here's some more sharp wave ripples. And what you can see is that they really stand out from the ongoing local field potential. They're very large deflections. Here we can see a couple of examples of them. In the lower traces of these, what we're looking at is the same data, but data that's just been band passed, which means that's only allowing a certain frequency through the band. And in particular, they're looking at a band between 80 and 200 hertz, so a really high frequency band. And that just highlights to you the ripple component of the sharp wave ripple. So it's taking away the large sharp wave and really just highlighting the ripple on its own. And then here in this inset, we can see that ripple component blown up about 10 times larger on the time axis. See, you can see the scale bar here showing us 50 milliseconds as opposed to the 500 millisecond scale bar being used for most of these. And just to brag a little bit, here are some sharp wave ripples that I've recorded recently over the last couple of months. And you can see very similar to those recorded by Logothetis et al. We see the large sharp wave with the quick ripple riding on top. And this is actually a fairly common phenomenon to see sharp wave ripples that occur in succession like this. So back to the Logothetis paper. They went ahead and did a frequency decomposition of the ripples and sharp waves in order to see what are the spectral components that make up the sharp wave ripple. And they found that there were really three major components. So they had this thing that they called HP sigma. The names for these are a little strange, but they had this thing that they called HP sigma, which is really this very low frequency component, and this is likely the sharp wave itself. Then they had this gamma component occurring right around 30 to 50 hertz. And this piece is one that's not talked about so much when talking about sharp wave ripples. And then, of course, they had the ripple itself occurring between 80 and about 140 hertz. So these three components are the main things that make up the sharp wave ripple. And sorry, my cat just knocked something over if you heard that noise. So the question that was really being sought after in this paper was not just are there sharp wave ripples in the hippocampus. That's something that's been known since the 80s. It is relatively novel to take a look at them in a monkey, but that's not really the main goal here. The main goal is to see what's going on in the rest of the brain. So just so happens that Logothetis and colleagues back in 2004 developed this really crazy looking contraption which allows them to put monkeys into an fMRI scanner with an upright bore. So if you've ever seen an MRI scanner on TV or maybe in person, you notice that the patient always lies down on their back and then gets slid into the magnet. Now that's great, but monkeys really don't like lying on their back. It's a very non-natural position for them, and they're really not comfortable there. So in order to make this more comfortable for the monkey, this is just an engineering tour de force. They created this upright bore magnet. And so in the top two drawings, you can see the schematics for the device. And it's so tall that it actually has a little staircase leading up to the top level. Here in the second picture, you can see the monkey in the middle of the giant magnet. And then down here, we can see the actual device itself. So the monkey would get loaded into this kind of tube-like thing, basically. And then you turn this whole thing upright, and it's on some kind of a lift, which will actually lift it up into the bore of the magnet. Now, you can imagine this is kind of a training feat to make a monkey comfortable with this. And for most of the data that was collected in this paper, the monkeys were actually anesthetized during the recordings. But they did do this study also with an awake monkey, which I can tell you would just require a crazy amount of training to slowly build the monkey up until they're comfortable with that environment. Because the thing is, you can train a monkey to be comfortable with anything, but you can't do it in one day. So just think about that difficulty in the methods as we go forward looking at the results. So what'd they find? They looked in the fMRI data at what's going on in the rest of the brain at the time of the sharp wave ripple. So this is a ripple-triggered fMRI average. And what we can see is that there's a huge increase in activation just after the sharp wave ripple. So this dotted line is the time point of the sharp wave ripple. And we can see this huge increase in activation as indicated by the red color here in many, many areas. And we can also see a deactivation or a decrease in activity going on in another large set of areas. Now, if you look into it in a little bit more detail, what you're going to see is that the entire neocortex, so kind of all of the higher order areas of the brain, are showing large increases in activation, except for V1, and I'll have another thing to talk about with that, and the entorhinal cortex. And then we also see some limbic structures, so amygdala, retrosplenial cortex, posterior cingulate, anterior cingulate, the insula, olfactory, and piriform cortex. These are all limbic areas kind of associated with maybe emotion, that kind of thing, like slightly lower level cortices than the neocortex. The big difference between the limbic cortices and the neocortex is just the anatomical layers of the cortex. But then the bigger differentiation probably is what we see here in the deactivated areas. So these deactivated areas, it turns out, are entirely subcortical. And that's kind of a crazy thing. All of the cortical areas are getting upregulated and all of the subcortical areas are getting downregulated. It's as if the hippocampus has this kind of special state of activity with the entire cortex, and the subcortical structures are being specifically shut out of the game, which is a very strange state of affairs, especially considering that the sharp wave ripple is a phenomenon that is primarily observed during sleep, a time when subcortical structures actually play an outsized role in the modulation of cortical activity. Now, I said I was going to come back and talk about V1, just an interesting aside. So Christoph Koch wrote a book in, I think, 2004 entitled Quest for Consciousness. And in this book, he goes through a large number of results talking about what consciousness might be based on the current knowledge of neuroscience at the time. And he actually has an entire chapter titled Consciousness is Not in V1. A whole chapter just showing you example after example of the idea that consciousness is clearly not in V1. And now here we see that V1 is being singled out as the one cortical area to show deactivation at the time of sharp wave ripples. And what's more, in the entire literature of hippocampal amnesia, so this is the effects of hippocampal damage on human memory and the type of amnesia that produces, the strongest dividing line in that literature is that anything that you are aware of using your memory for will be impaired if you have hippocampal damage. So anything that you are conscious of is something that will be susceptible to damage of the hippocampus, whereas anything that you are not aware of is something that will likely remain intact after hippocampal damage. So it's interesting that the hippocampus, this structure that seems to really have a strong differentiation between processing of conscious information on the one hand and not processing non-conscious information on the other hand, and we see that V1 is the one structure singled out as not really involved or even suppressed during these sharp wave ripple events. And then the entorhinal cortex, just in case you're wondering about that. Now, the entorhinal cortex, of course, is the area that acts as the hub for connectivity between the hippocampus and the rest of the entirety of the cortex. So what's likely going on here is just that the entorhinal cortex is always going to be active along with the hippocampus. So it can't really change as a result of the sharp wave ripple since it's just always on. So that's this figure, and let's take a look now. You may be wondering, okay, well, is this just something anytime the hippocampus revs up, we see this kind of pattern of connectivity or pattern of activity change, I should say. So they took a look at gamma power increase triggered fMRI. So now rather than looking at sharp wave ripples, they're going to just look at when gamma power increases. And what they see, gamma being oscillatory activity between about 30 and 60 cycles per second. And what they see is that as the amplitude of that oscillation increases, you do indeed see an increase in activity in a large number of brain areas, but it's a completely different set of brain areas from those that were modulated by the sharp wave ripple. And there really isn't so much in the way of deactivation or suppression going on. So next, they wanted to take a look at the time course. Now, you got to be cautious when looking at a time course with fMRI. fMRI is a really slow signal. The hemodynamic response function, which is what the fMRI bold signal is actually sensitive to, is a signal that has about a 14-second time constant. A neuron fires in less than 1 millisecond, so we're just not at the right time scale. But nevertheless, we can see that there are some differences in this kind of coarse timescale. And what they found was that the thalamus seems to show suppression almost at the same time and even beginning to show suppression before the sharp wave ripple even happens, almost as if changes in thalamic activity might allow some kind of a permissive state that leads to the sharp wave ripple. And then they found that in terms of cortical areas, there were two different clusters. So there was this cluster indicated in blue that seemed to happen a little bit less strongly, perhaps, and a little bit earlier. And then this cluster that in green that happened a little bit more strongly and a little bit later. So to unpack that a little bit, it turns out that the green cluster is largely sensory areas, and dominated by visual and posterior cortices. So we see kind of a retrosplenial posterior cingulate, some primary visual, well, not primary visual, but some early visual cortices. And then the blue cluster is prefrontal, so medial prefrontal and orbital prefrontal. These are areas that are known to be connected to the hippocampus and important for processing of emotion. And they also are sensitive to reward prediction error and things of that nature. So kind of a different set of areas than these more stimulus processing type areas, these kind of emotion processing areas, and then somatosensation, and let's see, what else do we have here? Auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. So that one is kind of sensory. And then premotor, an area involved in the planning of actions. So it always gets a little wishy-washy to try and overinterpret fMRI results, so maybe we shouldn't. But to leave it at just the idea that the thalamus seems to lead suppression, and and then there are these two different sets of cortical areas that may be modulated somewhat independently. So finally, they wanted to ask what's normally correlated with the hippocampus just at rest when there's no sharp wave ripple going on. Turns out the hippocampus is correlated with itself, no surprise. And then there's a few other areas that are also correlated. V1, still out of the game. A few other areas, though, that are also correlated with the hippocampus, but it's nowhere near this widespread thing that we see when a sharp wave ripple occurs. So the sharp wave ripple phenomenon really is something quite special. So to conclude, what they found in this paper, Logothetis and colleagues, 2012, is that the hippocampus and the cortex are in a privileged communication state immediately after sharp wave ripples. Now, I think I did mention earlier, sharp wave ripples usually occur during sleep, and it has been shown that selectively stopping sharp wave ripples leads to worse memory. So what might be going on here is that the sharp wave ripple is effectively a way for the hippocampus to communicate information about recently encoded memories out to the rest of the cortex as a mechanism of consolidation. And here in this study, we're actually seeing how that might come about in this privileged communication between the hippocampus and the cortex. The activity of subcortical structures is suppressed at the time of sharp wave ripples, so this is perhaps a way to make sure that the subcortical structures don't interfere with the communication that's going on between the hippocampus and the rest of the cortex. The state is specific to sharp wave ripples and is not seen under other conditions, so this is not just the general state of affairs. This is in fact a really rare and kind of special phenomenon that's going on. And then the suppression of activity in the thalamus seems to lead the sharp wave ripple. Now, I'm highlighting that one just because the thalamus is this kind of switchboard area that is likely important for coordinating many different aspects of cortical function. So the fact that it is suppressing before the sharp wave ripple happens may indicate that it's actually creating some sort of a permissive state that allows the ripple to take place. Perhaps hinting at where the where the ripple is actually being generated from. So that's it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe, and hopefully you'll watch another video next week. Thanks. Bye.